Hi, this is Dr. Randy Bach. Today's July 6, 2022. I do a weekly coronavirus conversation Facebook Live video cast, and goes on YouTube and some other venues, Twitter and so forth. Generally, I try to talk about the facts surrounding um, how we've handled the pandemic, and how we've handled people who speak out their own opinions about the pandemic. Very often I get certain feedback which is ad hominem, which is against the person, the man, against me. What are your, who are you to talk about this? And people, have Google at their fingertips. Um, I've had an interesting past, and I want to maybe have you all learn a little bit about this. It's not necessarily going to change your lives, but I think it's reasonable to have it out there, because when you Google my name, Randall S. Bach, MD, you'll find some things that seem quite unsavory, and I want to somewhat set the record straight on what's what in that regard. So I am a general practice physician. I've been doing primary care since the mid 1980s. I graduated. I grew up in New York City. Went to Horace Mann School, private school in New York City. Then I went to Yale University, graduated with a BS in chemistry. It was technically also chemistry and physics. I went out to medical school in short order, graduated in 1981 at the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. I did an internship in New Haven, Connecticut, rotating. I spent a year working out in West Virginia on my own. There was no commitment to do so. I just wanted to get out of the regular track. I had been slated to become a psychiatrist, and I wanted to get kind of away from the grind of academic, just kind of medical school, internship, residency, and put some of my hard-earned skills to use. I was also breaking up from my long-term girlfriend, and there are just a few things going on. So I spent a year in literally the poorest county in the continental U.S., amongst others in West Virginia, and saw a very interesting population. West Virginia is its own story. I don't want to spend too much time at that, but basically it was the kind of the purest culture in a sense at the time in the United States. That is, the fewest people had migrated in, the fewest number of people had migrated out of West Virginia over the preceding few hundred years. So I saw kind of very old style cultures, a little bit like what you might see from the Amish, Mennonite, and so forth, in various of the hollers in West Virginia. And West Virginia also has the most roads per person, so people generally lived on the end of their own roads. It was a bit of an interesting culture bit. I came back and did psychiatry residency at Mass General Hospital in Boston. It didn't really take. I probably had been sowing too many oats, and I kind of had a cowboy independent aspect to myself, and I didn't really acclimate well to Mass General. And mutually, we agreed to part ways within the first year of my psychiatry residency, and I wound up doing primary care. I rotated through a couple different places. I worked at some of the poorest places in Massachusetts. I worked at Columbia Point, which is probably the most dangerous part of the state at the time, Dorchester, amongst other places, South Boston and whatnot, Charlestown, a lot of different situations before kind of landing on my feet at my own place, ultimately in Revere. It was run by the Lynn Hospital, called Atlantic Care, in Revere. And within a couple of years, I wound up kind of taking possession of the place, buying them out, and so forth. And I ran my own primary care office in Revere for 27 years. And I saw all manner of primary care patient in that duration. But I was able, running my own place, I was able to kind of tack this way and that and do things where I saw need. So, I had spoken some I learned some Spanish. I'd known French pretty much, but I learned Spanish kind of on the fly in medical school. And around Revere and Chelsea and Lynn, there was a high Spanish clientele. I wound up advertising in Spanish newspapers there. And there were other kind of niche aspects that I did. I treated obesity when that was a thing. When Viagra came out, I had I wound up doing some of that. I advertised for that. I had to make money. I was, starting a family, married, kids, and all that kind of stuff. And I had my regular primary care all along the way, and I saw multi generations in Revere, and was somewhat a fixture actually on Main Street. I was right on Broadway downtown, such as there is downtown in Revere, which is a working class town, right contiguous with Boston. And one of those ventures that I undertook was narcotic detoxification, not for myself, but for treating others. This is a time in the mid 2000s when Suboxone was coming out according to the DATA, the Data 2000 Act, Drug Addiction Treatment Act, under the Bush years. And the idea was to somewhat destigmatize narcotic treatment and bring Suboxone, which is a narcotic itself, it's buprenorphine, rhymes with morphine, out to the, kind of the addicted public, but without having them have to run to methadone clinics and whatnot. And I took this treatment on, but with my own kind of way of doing things. I didn't want to do a short-term detox, which I think are usually hugely unsuccessful. People go in for 5-7 days or whatever, and they go back to the same milieu, the same habits they had, and they wind up bouncing right back into drug use oftentimes. And I didn't want to do the forever model of methadone maintenance, which is months and potentially years of treatment. So I came up with what I called kind of, at some point I called the Goldilocks. She didn't want too hot, too cold, too soft, too hard. I wound up with kind of the median approach, which was about a 4 to 5 month gradual detox approach. Probably less than a 1% decline per day, but always in the same direction of declining doses. And people had to be compliant in the sense that they had to be doing no other narcotics or other drugs at the time. And I also I couldn't enforce, but I wanted them to do better in their lives. I think that, and I still think that addiction is not a disease per se, but it is kind of a way of being. And in a sense, it's a trauma. Breaking your hip is a trauma. It can change your life. You might die from it, but it's not a disease per se. It's a kind of a sign of other issues having taken place. And addiction's somewhat like that. And so, I had a different approach to it, and I wanted to detox people a lot. As it turns out, Suboxone was kind of advertised and taught to us, novitiate buprenorphine prescribers, as potentially for detox or potentially for maintenance, without any kind of like enforcement one way or another. I actually lectured for the pharmaceutical company Reckitt Benckiser, which is a British company here in the United States, to try to encourage other physicians to get over the hump and not be frightened by Suboxone, and let them know what it was like to have Suboxone prescribed to patients. People formerly addicted to, say, street narcotics, OxyContin, heroin, and whatnot, injecting and or people from methadone, to come into their own clinics and see how it would change their own clinics. It did change mine. I mean, my regular clientele didn't necessarily always enjoy kind of the rougher, gruffer, tougher clientele from the methadone / heroin / injection crowd. A lot of them had kind of underlying psychological problems more on average. All of life is a Venn diagram. There's some overlap. There's some people who just happened upon, say, narcotics or whatever. But I think people who wound up getting addicted usually had some other underlying issues and things they had to get over. So I gave them a kind of a gradual time to kind of reacclimate to life. And I think people are addictable in the sense that we wind up being addicted to one thing or another. I was playing squash a lot back then. I play tennis a lot now. And, I like the runner's high. And I think we all need kind of that, opiate-like pop, some people get addicted to sex or whatever. I mean, the endorphins are named after morphine in a sense. They're endogenous opiates. Really, it's the other way around, that the opiates we take out in the wild only work because we have had the template for opiate use in our own heads, because that's the axis of pleasure for us. So when we have an orgasm, or we accomplish something, when we run or win a race, get applauded, we get a little, jolt of our own natural morphine in a sense. And so my whole theme and theory was that, yes, people are addictable, and yes, they were addicted to the substance, and yes, they were kind of doing oftentimes malfeasant activities felonies and whatnot to steal and do this and that in order to get their drug. But it didn't have to be that way. Things go wrong when you kind of violate your own precepts and your morality in pursuit of any drug or any action. So that was the program that I had, and I ran it, I think, fairly successfully, and I was somewhat strict. Some people on the street called me Dr. No, the James Bond evil character, but in the sense that I would say no. Oftentimes people wanted more drug, I would say no. They wanted to go up in their dose, I would say no. I don't think that may be a bad person. I think a lot of people need structure, and I think a lot of the people who are addicted had kind of had an absence of structure, and oftentimes in their early lives. I think people, it's a term that I made up, were somewhat underparented, undersupervised, often fatherless, especially the men. And, people get into trouble without guidance, without structure and constraint. It was a little bit of a trick to run it in concordance with my regular kind of sore throats, broken bones, blood pressure, diabetes, all the regular patients and whatnot. And it became rather an active part of my clientele, at one point probably reaching half of what I was doing as a physician. Why do I bring this up? Well, because thus my troubles began. I think I was doing the right thing. I always did, and if I had to do it over again, I probably might change a few things at the margins, but not overall, had I been doing the same activity. I'm going to read you something that's an article that came out in 2020, but just to kind of cut to the chase, I wound up having a complaint here or there over the years from disgruntled narcotic addicts. And some of them were vindictive, some of them were, I think, personal based, that they had their own issues. And a couple of them were, I think, to get at me and to bring me down. I don't want to get political, but, oftentimes we've seen that things come out about people when they are in a position where some people might not want them to be there, or there's jealousy, whatever. For my taste, the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearing, I believe it was in 2020, was indicative. Here's an upstanding guy, a lawyer and a judge and whatnot, and nothing was said about him for decades, and all of a sudden he's going to be in the Supreme Court, and everyone has all these, kind of mysterious stories about him as a teenager or whatnot, and none of it was really verifiable. And some people ran with it, and they made it lurid, and he's still haunted to this day. The situation was not quite the same for me, because these were people whom I had seen, and I don't deny having seen certain of these patients, but the stories that got told were, kind of beyond belief. And in certain instances, I literally had audio tape disproving the things that people said. And at the board of registration medicine, kind of the state medical board, I was not believed. And this is part of something I want to get at perhaps today, or perhaps in other issues of this podcast, which is that, what we call woke, or kind of this, Marxist critical theory approach, wherein the, social justice is something that you should be pursuing rather than actual justice. That is to say that your views or your actions might be discounted based on who you are. If you're from an upper class or privileged class, then you should be kind of taken down a few notches. And if you're from an underprivileged class, that must mean there had been some previous injustice perpetrated or performed upon you, and therefore you need to have retribution, even though the particular case might not warrant it. I had a complaint against me. So anyway, so just to kind of get to the complaint part, I don't think I had an inordinate amount of complaints. I had no real complaints prior to this, aside from a couple of random ones over the years, and I had no malpractice cases against me in decades of my own working there. I did basically an English-style GP office. That is to say, I did an outpatient clinic, and I pretty much did all my work there. And if patients need to be hospitalized, I would pass them off, like pass the baton to other physicians who worked in hospital, or to specialists for that particular problem. And I didn't really have any complaints. I pretty much knew what I knew, and I knew what I didn't know, and I knew how to kind of take the things I didn't know and have people see them who did know. That is to say, I worked within my means and capabilities and ran it as a business. I wanted to be successful, and I think people had a really good time there for the most part as patients. They've always remarked how well run the place was, and I don't really take credit for that, except that I gave, I empowered my staff to be able to be good, and I was able directly to observe them and have the hiring and firing capability. So, the very rare times that people weren't really up to stuff, they didn't really last in my clinic, as opposed to some other places where they might have, unions or sinecures or whatever, not be able to be removed from office or a job. Anyway, so that's kind of a long preface. Part B of my preface is that when I was doing this narcotic detox program, at any given moment early on, I had the ability to write prescriptions of Suboxone for 30 people, and that number, within a few years went up to higher numbers, I think 60, and then maybe it's 100 now. But I only wanted people who were very interested in doing the detox approach to be on my program. So I had a $185 entry fee for all patients as a kind of an administrative fee to let them know what the program was. And if they wanted to be in it, they would stay. And if not, I would refund their money right away, and they could go on to, say, more maintenance type program, which might be in their interest. So I wanted to understand that we are interested in people bettering their lives, not just getting off drugs. So getting off drugs would be fine, but in order to really kind of better their lives, they had to, do some things along the way that might have them be, make them more comfortable within their own skin, so they wouldn't be out seeking drugs or other issues. Anyway, this could turn into a long discussion. But one point is that I kind of had more of a rotating flow of patients. And so over the course of maybe the 8 years or so that I was doing narcotic detox, I had about 1,500 different narcotic detox patients, and I did about 2,000 different initiations of detox. Some of them were repeat customers, obviously. As opposed to the people who had and kept 30 individual patients for long periods of time on maintenance. So the analogy that I came up with was I was basically running a city bus, which had multiple stops, and a lot of people might stay on for the long duration of the whole trip, but some people got on the bus while other people were getting off. The people getting off were the people who really didn't want ultimately to do the detox, might have found that 1% per day decline a little bit too stringent, or they were really more invested in doing other drugs, or not really, maybe they wanted something temporarily, but they weren't really interested or ready to kind of begin a clean life, which is neither here nor there for me. I wanted other people who did want that opportunity more than they to be on. And so I kept the 30 number. I was writing for only 30 people at a time, but over the years I had a higher flux of patients. The reason I mentioned that is, out of 1,500 patients, I had maybe 4 or 5 complaints over that 8 years. And so that's not really a high, but it's a very low batting average of complaints. But in absolute number, it was higher than many other doctors were encountering. We see this in the world of OBGYN, where they pay much higher malpractice rates than other physicians because they go through a lot of deliveries. And if one thing goes wrong, there's a complaint, and it winds up being very expensive. So it's not quite, maybe that's not a quite perfect analogy. But for the other doctors who are writing Suboxone, again, they were, I would say 95% of them ultimately, or maybe more, were doing maintenance approach. So they were just kind of doing the methadone clinic model within their own clinics. So long story short, the first complaint I had from a narcotic-related patient of mine was a reasonable complaint, and she thought she was being tapered too much, too quickly. She had some complaints about my kind of, let's say, forthright approach, which she thought was a little bit cold and clinical, to use the word in a different sense. And she wanted, to complain about that. Fine. So I wrote maybe 6 or 7 pages. I talk a lot, I write a lot. And the board at the time had a different approach from ultimately it got in the early 2010s. So at that time it was before the chairman of the medical board, who was there for about a decade, Dr. Candace Lapidus Sloan. And my response to that complaint was heard, and the complaint disappeared. Thereafter, though, was not the same. I didn't really keep up with politics from the medical board because I had no reason ever to. But in 2011 or 2012, I got a complaint from a patient I had seen only once. And he made some rather outrageous claims about 3 or 4 months after I saw him, that I had kind of poked him. I had thrown his glasses on the ground. I had called his wife a bad name. Things that aren't really me. I mean, I stop at stop signs. If my wife thinks I drive too slowly, I obey the laws, I pay my taxes, all that kind of stuff. He was 10 years younger, 40, 50 pounds heavier, and about 3 inches taller than me, about 6'3", big guy. If I had done something untoward towards him in the room, mind you, at the time, there were 6 or 7 people in the office. Everyone would have known about it. Nobody knew about it. Nobody said a word after he left. He wound up not being one of my patients. I think it was an interesting case. I remember it really well because he had been disabled from his regular real job, and he had worked at a prominent company locally, and he had an excellent job. He wound up having some back surgeries, and he wound up kind of going at the disability route. And he kept his disability, wound up on drugs. He wound up selling heroin, working on people's houses, all that kind of stuff. And my question and query with him, which I remember very vividly, is, I spent some time. I said, look, we can get you, as I said before, we can get you off narcotics. That's not really an issue. We can get you off your narcotics, put you on our temporary narcotic, but it won't really change the way you feel about yourself, which I think, that has much more to do with why you're doing drugs than the drugs per se. I mean, obviously you have an addiction, but if you want to stay away from it, you have to kind of live better. He says, you're not going to take away my disability, are you? I said, no, that's not my job. I think that, because you can, spend time selling heroin and working on fences and working on your mom's house and doing all these other things, you're very entrepreneurial in a sense, and you have the capabilities physically, and you're a big, strong guy, and you had your surgeries, and you seem to be better from them. That's really up to you to decide. That's kind of a moral decision, and you're going to make that decision. I'm not going to be tattling or calling up the state or the company, or whatever, on you. I think that's something you have to do. Anyway, I wound up leaving the room at one point. He had to do a blood test or whatever. I'm walking by, and he sees me in the room. He sees me walking by, he calls me in, he says, and he's kind of sad. He says, Dr. Bach, you were right. I said, what am I right about? He said, I'm lazy. And he had this kind of confessional. He wept a little bit. I said, that's okay. The realization is the first way and the only way of fixing things. And we had a really interesting talk out of that. I was kind of shocked that, he didn't come back, and he didn't come in for detox. And his letter was dated like 4 full months later. And he said all these things about me. And we had kind of an intense time. And after that, I tried to, after this complaint came in, I tried to maybe, kind of be a little bit more aloof somewhat, and have some of the things I say, I put on videotape so people could watch rather than have me in front of them, and kind of take, kind of the pressure or the kind of the temperature down in the room. But I was brought in front of the board without even knowing what this complaint was, probably in 2013 or so, 2012, 2013. And when I read that letter that he had wrote, I'm like, wow, that guy shouldn't be a doctor. It just doesn't happen to be me. I mean, I wasn't laughing at the time. But they do this funny thing. They don't actually give you due process at the board. They just kind of spring this stuff upon you, and you're supposed to react. Maybe they want to see how you react. And there have been some complaints from some of the kind of the defense counsel, the attorneys who represent physicians at the medical board, about some of these really anti-due process techniques that they use. They spring things on you. They should give you an opportunity, as in most legal cases, to have discovery where you see what they're going to presenting. And it has a little bit of a Soviet tinge, a surprise kind of kangaroo court aspect. Anyway, this complaint kind of like turned my world upside down. And I understood it later by reading an article in 2019 about the medical board. It's in the Boston Magazine by an article by Michael Damiano. And I can't remember the title, but you can Google it based on that. And I could show a link about what is the essence of the board. And the board was supposed to have only single 1-year terms for the board chair, but for pretty much the entire decade from the early 2010s on, it had a single chairperson, this Dr. Candace Lupita Sloan, and she saw herself as a patient advocate. And again, this refers to my thoughts about social justice, wherein justice is going to be performed based on these social intersectional aspects of who's who and who's had previous injustices. So this kind of became a big thing, and I was told to, kind of do, get personality tested at various points along the way during the board process. They kind of give you a carrot and a stick, and the carrots aren't that great. I mean, the carrots are that you kind of have to bring a physician in to have yourself be supervised while you pay that physician to be in your practice at the time, to go, kind of weekly therapy sessions, monthly group sessions, all this kind of stuff while you're supposed to be running your own medical practice and being an adult and whatnot. Again, I had no real complaints against me prior to this. And I think I pretty much knew and continue to know the bounds of what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. And I treated, again, for decades, patients within Revere for primary care, and then for this shorter period of time for narcotic detox, as well as other issues. So I did, I bristled at that perhaps, and I thought it all kind of percolate out. The truth would come. But I kind of had Chinese water torture of a few other complaints as this process was going on. And I wound up going in front of the board for suspension. To this day, I still can't believe not only did I lose the hearing, but I lost it 8-0. You know, I lost in a shutout. For a baseball game, wouldn't be close at all. And you know, I thought I would get my license back right away. I tried to keep my office open. In the meanwhile, I kept staff on, and you know, the clinic was me at the time. It was a solo practice. It was a very beautiful clinic, but it was hard to keep everything going. I was told there would be a 7-day emergency hearing, and I thought, oh, you know, just this will be kind of a, you know, feather in the wind and flip away. It took about 7 weeks to get heard. It took 7 more months at least before the decision came down. So almost a full year. It was, you know, I was suspended in January of 2014. It wasn't until November of 2014, you know, full 10 months later, that I heard an answer, and the answer was not in my favor. It turns out they had adjudicated on the wrong, you know, kind of level of evidence. I don't want to get, it's very technical stuff, but they should have told me, kind of like an automotive recall. You know, they should have called me back in to give me the right hearing under the right evidence standard. They never said a word, and I was out in the wilderness before my attorney, who was not an expert in board matters, finally percolated everything through, and we got a rehearing, but it was not until 2018. It was from the same magistrate who had kind of like, you know, signed off on everything the board thought the first go around. But you know, I remember, I looked through the transcripts, I can't find it. But during that hearing, we had, I think, 6 days in March and April of 2018. He leaned over the bench and said, Dr. Bach, you know, I mean, he'd heard all this kind of bad stuff about me, and he kind of leaned over. He says, I get you. You actually care about the individual patients. You put your heart and soul into this. And I said, yes. And I mean, maybe I imagined this. My attorney remembers it. I remember it, but I do not see it in the transcript. Maybe she thought it was off, you know, off the record kind of thing. Because I really did want to find it and quote it. Maybe I'll ask him someday, but I don't want to go near anybody judicial in the meanwhile. Long story short, I won that. I got, basically, I would have gotten my license back. The board put some impediments in my way. They made me make a new lapsed license application. They should have just handed it right back to me. They didn't. I did what I could. I tried to get the license back as soon as possible. They kept kind of putting me off. I wound up having a case to the SJC, which is the Supreme Judicial Court here, our version of the Supreme Court in Massachusetts, and I was ruled in my favor in 2019. And they basically begrudgingly gave me my license back. They stipulated they wouldn't touch it for a few years, but in turn, they actually resuspended it somewhat on a triviality. I had a video channel for my patients. It was all with their permission. I had them sign releases and everything like that. It turns out the releases were not quite up to snuff, but people all knew what they were doing. And I basically had people in you know, doing detox who were happy with it, and showed to others perhaps and potentially how they could get off you know, drugs and try to improve their lives. I had this very, kind of seems silly, but I had 5 F's, if I can remember them all. It was family, friends, faith, funds, which is money, and only lastly was fun. So when you get some of those elements, those 5 F's back in your life, you have a bigger solidity. You kind of have, you know, 5 legs under your table instead of just 1 or 0, and you're a little bit more sturdy in how you can approach life. And so it was a little bit, I wasn't looking for more patients. I didn't do it as advertising. I didn't have my website or my phone number up on any of the videos. I wanted other people in the throes of narcotic addiction to be able to hear from actual addicts and or people formerly addicted what it was like and how they could make their lives better, and that they didn't necessarily need to be on methadone forever. And particularly when they're pregnant, for instance, they didn't need to stay on methadone. That people, you know, gave experiences what it was like to give birth to a baby, you know, who had to do with the withdrawal that you didn't want to do in the first place. And there were all kinds of other circumstances like that. There were, I think it's frankly some of the best work I've ever done in my life. I can't show it to anybody because after I was suspended, that wound up being its own case. I think it became kind of like a suitcase full of money in the middle of the street. It became a, you know, what they call, I think, a moral hazard. And it was irresistible for certain people to sue me once I was somewhat defrocked medically. And, you know, to think that they had their videos with me. Nobody complained about videos while I was running the channel as a full-fledged doctor. But afterwards, this case turned into its own thing. The board wound up resuspending me based on this kind of case that was brought by one of the patients who had been videotaped. And that was eventually thrown out as well. And so I was given my license back in full, and for the final time, hopefully, in 2020. I somewhat had my legs cut out from under me. I couldn't run my own clinic, and I had already rented out the space I worked in. My clinic was gone. There was a tornado on top of it all, and so I've been trying to pick up the pieces ever since. With some of the spare time that I've had, I've written these books I've mentioned. I have a book out, Overturning Zika, and I've got 3 other books in the offing. One is a general book, Compendium on Cancer, which I think is a really fascinating book, even though there are a lot of books on cancer. I'm going to get to that one. And I have one book really talking about my theories about narcotic addiction, currently titled Withdraw to Freedom, which I'm hoping to put out within this year as well. Anyway, so I just wanted to put that out because people will oftentimes say, oh, you are a bad guy, you were suspended. And so I put defenses out. Maybe I'll just be able to refer to this video in future. I'm going to share with you something that's in the Revere Journal, which is the Revere newspaper. This is from December 2021. Dr. Bach vindicated, suspension reversed. This is me. There's a long legal process. So I've been there 27 years, had all of his original 2014 suspension claims reversed. It was a long legal process extended by the Massachusetts Board of Registration. Anyway, it's a lot of what I've already said, so I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I'll put a link up, or maybe this PDF, so you can see what's there. But it talks about the video case, the books out, my trials and tribulations, and so forth. So I'm going to let's see if I just move the show around a bit. So this is the article. There's one other thing maybe I should bring up. I think it's a matter of public record now. I have a legal case in federal court. This is Randall Bach versus the erstwhile chair and co-chair of the medical board, verified complaint for violation of the Sherman Act. And so you can pause this if you want to spend time on this paragraph number 1. I don't think I was treated fairly or well. There are times during my prosecution through the board that it was made evident that it was my ideas and conceptions about addiction that had me, treated more harshly and kept away from the medical realm in this total of 6 years. I maybe go down to paragraph 13 here. You can, I might maybe make a link to this as well. That talks a little bit about the essence of treatment itself. There's no medical law that says you cannot detox people. I think I did a very gentle 4-month detox, and there's been a lot of talk about what is the actual proper duration for treating with replacement narcotic. Anyway, this is a lot to get through in a video. It's better to be read, but that's if this case moves forward, there's no guarantee because it's an unusual statute. The Sherman Act historically was used against larger corporations. More recently, it's been used for things such as what we're talking about here. In legal terms, this is we're calling this the lifetime subscription model. We make an analogy to Harry's Shave Club or Gillette, where they kind of give the razor away for free or less than cost, and they get you on the razor blades. And the idea here is there's a lot of money to be made by keeping people on opiates within the medical establishment, and that tends to be the way the medical establishment looks at this right now. It wasn't always the case. My idea and addiction of treatment was really the standard throughout all of medical history, at least modern medical history through the 20th century and into the 21st century as well. Even now, there's obviously debate about it. There are certain institutions and groups that might come down and say, oh, addiction's a disease, and that's the disease model and so forth. But I don't think it's absolute. I mean, clearly, it's, we had at least one president who was a former addict and had a disease, yet George W. Bush conquered at least his cocaine addiction and his alcohol addiction and went on to do great things, whether you agree with him politically or not. He's done more with his life than many/most all of us have. And that's by dealing, he became a born-again Christian, and he did one of my 5 F's. He did faith, and he came to terms with his self and his deficiencies and found guidance and support outside. I think that's what we all need. I think, we think we can pursue individuality, but we need trust and hope with others. We form congregations and religious groups of one type or another, whether political or genuinely religious, one way or another, friends, families, sports, all this kind of stuff. We are tribal in a way, and we look to that. Anyway, what's my point here? My point is that, it's somewhat been in my manner to say what I think, whether it was about addiction or later about Zika, or now about coronavirus or vaccines or whatever it is. I try to give you the straight, honest truth. I am an imperfect individual. I've had, probably some of the things I wish I'd done more carefully. Perhaps like the release forms, I should have had it shown in front of multiple lawyers. I showed it to my one lawyer, and he's the one who passed on the form that I had. Maybe I should have had a different lawyer. Maybe I should have had a different lawyer to do one thing or another. But we can't micromanage everything we do. I was listening to a Steve Jobs interview. He's, I guess, discussing in front of the Apple stockholders, maybe 15 years ago. I think when the iPhone was just, still in his head, and there was a questioner in the audience who got on his case. He says, "You want to do this and this and this. This is impossible. This you can't do. You're having trouble with this. Why are you recommending all these things?" He said, "Well, look, yes, I'm not, the best engineer. I can't make sure that everything's going to be there. I have certain standards I want to see. I have a vision for it, and we are working at it. And we're going to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes over and over and over again. And it's only by making those mistakes are we going to be able to come up with something that's better than what we come up with to begin with. And if we just do nothing and wait for something to be perfect, we will never have anything." So, I stand by the narcotic detox program I had. And again, I have a book on it. It doesn't mean it's the right best thing for everybody, but it was certainly the right best thing for the people who benefited from it. I think it's a better plan and idea than being on maintenance forever. I think it's a better idea to think that you have agency over your life, that you can control things, that you can get better from your addiction, just like President George W. Bush did. I'm sure many others I don't think we necessarily need to be constrained by our worst activities. I think we can always aspire to better. And we, frankly, are validated by those concepts and ideas. It's only by kind of giving yourself up to the concepts around you, to noticing things are better and accepting that you didn't do perfectly, can you, improve in your life and feel fulfilled and go to sleep without worry. Anyway, so from a position of imperfection, I presumably am speaking to other people with similar imperfections. I just thought I would bring this out. There's not that much tolerance kind of for ideas that are not in the orthodoxy. And perhaps next time I'll talk about this a little bit. And I guess all this was prompted by my wife's bringing up an article by Pierre Curie in, I think it's Real Clear Politics, health section, about the kind of the shunting off and the penalizing of doctors who have opinions that are different from what is considered mainstream at any given moment. It's a shock that today, I have a psychologist friend who's looking for a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist in Massachusetts, who does not ascribe to this kind of gender bending, surgical approach, literally surgical approach to childhood sexual dysmorphia, whatever you want to call it, and does not want to go the hormone or mutilatory cutting off genitals or secondary sex aspects for children. And we can't find anyone. We can't find a single child psychiatrist who's not on board with kind of this very, very, very new, very radical concept. And, so is it science? I mean, nowadays you can't find physicians. I was taking medical tests, CME courses where people don't use the word woman in the test. They're using birthing person, stuff like that. That's not medicine. That's not science. And so, we either have, an outward reality to which the sciences ascribe, or we have orthodoxy and propaganda. And lastly, my wife, Lynn, brought up the great movie Death of Stalin, which is a satire. It's a comedy, but it contains literally factual events where Stalin when he gets sick, he can't find a doctor because he's imprisoned all the good doctors. All the doctors who tell the truth and didn't follow propaganda, they're not around anymore. So he couldn't find a single one. He has to kind of go to prison, sift through the prisons and find somebody who's been shackled up in order to actually give him medical care when he needs one because he's ill. Let's hope we don't get to that point. I hope you enjoyed this. Please let me know if you'd like any of the background information, or you want to chat about it, or if you have any other ideas. But speaking from personal experience, we need not to let the social justice inhibit with justice. It's okay to be social. It's okay to have justice, and it's okay to sympathize. But facts are facts, and you have to let the individuals rise or fall based on their own merits or lack thereof. Anyway, and that goes, frankly, too for viruses. You need not let extraneous factors or who's saying what cloud your view. The facts stand by themselves, and the truth will out, and the truth gets a vote. So thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions about this, and thank you for listening.